Go, now, get behind the car.
But the boys, they're scared.
I'll cover you, just move.
The black Mercedes purred to a stop in front of the iron gates. Marco Valentino stepped out first, his tailored suit catching the afternoon sun. He turned back with a smile that had charmed half of the city's elite, extending his hand toward the woman still seated inside. Come, Isabella. Welcome to your new home. Isabella Rossi emerged like a vision in cream silk, her perfectly manicured hand sliding into his. She was everything the city expected of a Mafia boss's fiancée, poised, beautiful, untouched by the uglier sides of his world. Her heels clicked against the cobblestone as she gazed up at the mansion, a soft gasp escaping her lips. Marco, it's magnificent. He wrapped an arm around her waist, pride swelling in his chest. 5 years of building this empire, brick by brick, deal by deal. Sometimes the deals were signed in blood, but that was a reality Isabella would never need to understand. She would live in the beauty he created, shielded from the violence that funded it. The mansion stood 3 stories tall, Mediterranean style with cream-colored stone and terracotta roof tiles. Balconies wrapped around the second floor, adorned with wrought iron railings and flowering vines. The grounds stretched for acres, manicured gardens leading to fountains that sparkled in the distance. This was power made visible. This was success, shall we? Marco gestured toward the gates. But as the driver moved to open them, Marco's eyes caught something that made his blood run cold. There, just beyond the left side of the gate, a figure hunched over a makeshift cart. The cart was piled with scrap metal, pieces of copper piping, old aluminum cans. Things people threw away without a second thought. And pulling that cart, her thin frame straining against the weight, was a woman in clothes that might have once been decent but now hung in tatters. Her hair, matted and unwashed, fell across her face. Her feet were bare, caked in dirt. But it wasn't those details that froze Marco in place. It was the 2 small children clinging to her torn skirt, twins. A boy and a girl. No more than 4 years old, with faces too thin and eyes too large for their small heads. They clutched at their mother's legs as she tried to move the cart. Their little fingers bone, white from gripping so tightly. Marco. Isabella's voice seemed to come from very far away. What is it? Why have we stopped? He couldn't answer. Couldn't breathe, because the woman had looked up, and despite the dirt and the desperation etched into every line of her face, he knew those eyes. He had once promised to love those eyes forever. Sophia. He whispered, the name felt like glass in his throat. His ex-wife stood frozen in the shadow of his gates, their children pressed against her. A cart of garbage, her only possession in the world. For a moment that stretched into eternity, their eyes met across the distance that separated them. Across the chasm of wealth and poverty, success and ruin. And in that moment, Marco Valentino realized that every choice he'd made for the past 5 years had led to this single, devastating point of collision. The story of how they'd arrived here began 6 years earlier, in a different world entirely. Marco Valentino hadn't always been a boss. There was a time when he'd been nobody. Just another kid from the wrong side of town with quick hands and quicker anger. His father had died in a factory accident when Marco was 12, leaving his mother to raise 3 boys on a seamstress's salary. They'd lived in a 2-room apartment that smelled like boiled cabbage and broken dreams. But Marco had been smart, street smart first, then book smart when a teacher noticed that the angry kid in the back row could solve equations faster than anyone else in class. He'd gotten a scholarship, studied business, dreamed of pulling his family out of poverty the legitimate way. That's where he'd met Sophia Delgado. She'd been studying art history. A scholarship kid like him, though her poverty wore different clothes. Her father had been a political dissident who'd fled South America with nothing but his daughter and his principles. They'd lived in the same neighborhood, shopped at the same discount stores, understood the same hunger. Their first conversation had happened in the university library at 2 in the morning. Marco had been studying for an economics exam, and Sophia had been sketching the reading room's architecture for a class project. She'd dropped her pencil, and it had rolled under his table. Sorry. She'd whispered, crawling under to retrieve it. You're drawing the ceiling. he'd asked, glancing at her sketch. The molding work is from 1892. See how the acanthus leaves curve? That's neoclassical revival. Most people never look up. He'd looked at her instead. Really looked. She wasn't conventionally beautiful, not like the girls who performed beauty like a second language. Sophia's beauty was quieter. Found in the intensity of her focus, the passion that animated her features when she talked about Thunder to her. I'm Marco. Sophia. That simple exchange had been the beginning of everything. They'd dated through the rest of college. Two poor kids building dreams out of library books and late-night conversations. Marco had graduated with honors, determined to climb the corporate ladder. Sophia had wanted to teach, to share her love of art and history with kids who needed beauty in their lives. They'd married the week after graduation in a tiny ceremony at City Hall. Marco's mother had cried. And Sophia's father had given a speech about love being the only wealth that mattered. They'd honeymooned in a borrowed apartment upstate, spending more time making love and planning their future than actually seeing the sights. I'm going to make you proud. Marco had promised, lying in bed with her head on his chest. I'm going to give you everything. I already had everything. She'd whispered back. I have you. But the legitimate world had other ideas about Marco Valentino's future. He'd applied to 50 companies after graduation. 50 carefully crafted applications. Each one highlighting his academic achievements, his leadership potential, his drive. He'd gotten 3 interviews. All 3 had ended the same way, with politer smiles and promises to keep your resume on file, that both parties knew were lies. The problem was simple: Marco's last name, Valentino, in this city. That name carried weight, and not the good kind. His uncle ran a loan sharking operation. His cousin had done time for extortion. The legitimate business world took one look at his background and saw risk, regardless of his individual merit. Meanwhile, bills piled up. Sophia had gotten a job teaching art at an inner-city school, but the salary was a joke. Marco worked 3 jobs, none of them using his degree. Night security at a warehouse, weekend shifts at a loading dock, early morning deliveries for a restaurant supply company. He worked 18-hour days and still watched Sophia skip meals so there'd be enough food. That's when his uncle Giacomo had made the offer. You're killing yourself for pennies, boy, Giacomo had said over espresso in a cafe that everyone knew was a front. You got brains, you got potential. Why you wasting it on legitimate work that don't want you anyway? Because I made promises to my wife. Promises don't feed families, Marco. Money does. Respect does. You think those corporate types are more honest than us? They just got better lawyers. Marco had walked away from that conversation. But the words had festered. A month later, when the landlord threatened eviction and Sophia had to pawn her grandmother's necklace just to keep the lights on, Marco had gone back. Just one job, he'd told himself. Just enough to get ahead. That's what he told Sophia too. When he'd finally confessed where the sudden influx of money had come from, Marco, no. She'd stood in their tiny kitchen, dish towel still in her hands, horror dawning in her eyes. You can't. We talked about this. Your uncle's world, it destroys people. It's temporary. Just until I can save enough to start something legitimate. I'm not going to be like them, Sophia. I'm smarter than that. That's what they all think. But he'd convinced her, or maybe she'd convinced herself, because the alternative was watching the man she loved work himself to death. She'd set conditions. 1 year maximum, no violence, nothing that could send him to prison, nothing that would change who he was. He'd agreed to all of it, believing every word. The first year, Marco had kept his promises. He'd run numbers, managed books, used his business degree to help his operations run more efficiently. He'd been good at it, too good. The money had started coming in steadily. They'd moved to a better apartment. Sophia had been able to buy art supplies for her classroom. Marco's mother had gotten the surgery she needed. See, he'd told Sophia. I told you I could manage this. But the second year, things had changed. Giacomo had died, sudden heart attack over his morning espresso. The organization had fractured, different factions fighting for control. Marco had found himself in the middle of a war he hadn't started. And the only way to survive was to fight. The first time he'd hurt someone, really hurt them, he'd come home shaking. Sophia had seen the blood on his knuckles, the haunted look in his eyes. What happened? Nothing. Business. Marco, your hands. I said it was nothing. He'd never raised his voice to her before. The shock on her face had been like a mirror, showing him what he was becoming. She'd cleaned his wounds in silence. And when she'd finished, she'd looked at him with eyes that held both love and fear. This is changing you. It's not. I'm still me. But they both knew it was a lie. By the third year, Marco had stopped pretending. He'd risen through the ranks not through loyalty to his uncle's memory, but through ruthless efficiency. And a willingness to do what others wouldn't. He'd consolidated power, eliminated rivals, built an empire on fear and respect. The money had poured in. He'd bought Sophia a house. Filled it with beautiful things she'd never asked for. He'd hired security to follow her, claimed it was for her protection, but really it was about control. About showing the world what belonged to him. Sophia had grown quieter. She'd stopped talking about her students, stopped sharing her day. The light that had drawn him to her in that library so long ago had dimmed. Come to dinner with me tonight. He'd demand, not ask. Russo's retiring. Big celebration. I have lesson plans to finish. So finish them later. This is important. Your work is always important, Marco. My work is just teaching poor kids about dead painters. The contempt in her voice when she'd said your work had stung more than any insult. Their fights had grown more frequent, more bitter. He'd accused her of not appreciating everything he'd given her. She'd accused him of selling his soul and expecting her to smile about it. Both accusations had been true. The night everything had shattered had started like so many others. Marco had come home late from a business meeting that had actually been a beating disguised as negotiation. His knuckles were split again. And there was someone else's blood on his shirt. He'd been drinking, something he'd started doing more and more. Sophia had been waiting up, which was unusual. Normally she went to bed early, pretending to be asleep when he finally came home. We need to talk, she'd said. Not tired. I'm Marco. I'm pregnant. The words had cut through his alcohol fog like a knife. He'd stared at her, seeing the tears in her eyes, the fear. What? I'm pregnant. Twins. The doctor thinks. I'm about 8 weeks along. He should have been happy. They'd talked about children in those early days. In the library and the borrowed apartment. But that had been different people, living a different life. This is good, he'd said. Forcing enthusiasm he didn't feel. This is great. We'll get a bigger place, hire help, you can quit that job. I don't want to quit my job. And I don't want to raise children in this world you've built. This world has given you everything. This world has given the man I married. She'd been shouting now, all the quiet resentment of 3 years spilling out. I did this for you. For us. Never asked for this. I asked for you, just you. The boy who solved equations and dreamed legitimate dreams. That boy is gone, Marco. You murdered him as surely as you've murdered everyone else who got in your way. He'd grab your arm then. Not hard but firmly, trying to make her understand. Don't you dare judge me. You've eaten the food this money bought, lived in the houses, worn the clothes. You don't get to play innocent. She'd wrenched her arm away, and in her eyes he'd seen something worse than anger, disgust. You're right, I'm not innocent. I'm complicit because I stayed. Because I kept hoping you'd remember who you were. But I can't anymore, Marco. I can't raise children to think this is normal. That violence and crime are acceptable if they come with nice things. So what, you're going to leave? Go back to that shithole apartment? That pathetic teacher's salary? If that's what it takes. He'd laughed, cruel and hard. You won't last a month, you've gotten soft, Sophia. You like the nice things more than you want to admit. Maybe. But I'd rather be poor and honorable than rich and corrupt. The word corrupt had hung in the air between them like a curse. Get out. What? You heard me, get out of my house. If I'm so terrible. If this life is so unbearable, then leave. But you don't get to take anything with you. No money, no jewelry, nothing that my corrupt money bought. You want to be noble. Be noble with nothing. She'd stared at him like he was a stranger, and maybe he was. I'll leave. But Marco. These babies are yours too. Don't you care about them at all? If they're going to be raised by a mother who hates their father, they're better off without me. It was the cruelest thing he'd ever said. And he'd said it to hurt her the way she'd hurt him, by holding up a mirror to what he'd become. She'd left that night, taking only her clothes and her father's old watch. He'd let her go, convinced she'd be back within days, broken and apologetic. She never came back. Months had passed. Marco had thrown himself into his work with renewed fury. He'd expanded operations, taken over 2 rival organizations, built his empire higher on the backs of other people's misery. He'd told himself he didn't care about Sophia, that she'd made her choice and he'd made his. But late at night, alone in the mansion he'd started building, he'd sometimes wake up reaching for her, forgetting for a moment that the other side of the bed was empty. He'd had men look for her, discreetly at first, then more desperately. She'd vanished completely. No paper trail, no credit card usage, nothing. It was like she'd become a ghost. Boss, maybe she don't want to be found. His lieutenant Tony had suggested carefully. I didn't ask for your opinion. Find her. But even Marco's extensive resources had turned up nothing. Sophia Delgado had effectively ceased to exist. After a year, he'd stopped looking. He'd started dating again, a succession of beautiful, vapid women who understood that being with Marco Valentino meant accepting expensive gifts and asking no questions. None of them lasted more than a few months. Then he'd met Isabella Rossi at a charity gala, one of those events where criminals and legitimate businessmen mingled and pretended they were different species. She'd been there with her father, a real estate developer who'd made his fortune straddling the line between legal and illegal. Isabella had been everything Sophia wasn't comfortable with his world, impressed by his power, content to be decorative and undemanding. She'd never asked where the money came from or what he'd done to earn it. She'd smiled at his associates, laughed at their crude jokes, played the role of Mafia princess like she'd been born to it. After 6 months of dating he'd proposed. Not out of love exactly, but out of a desire to fill the empty spaces in his life with something that looked like happiness from a distance. Isabella had said yes immediately, already planning a wedding that would be the social event of the year. And now, on what should have been a triumphant day, showing his fiancée the completed mansion, the symbol of everything he'd built, Marco stood frozen at his own gates, staring at the ruins of his actual life. Sophia's hands trembled on the cart handle. She'd known this neighborhood was dangerous, had tried to avoid it. But the scrap dealer on the east side paid better and she'd been desperate. The twins needed food, not the watered-down soup they'd been surviving on. She'd thought she could slip through quickly, collect the copper piping she'd spotted in a construction dumpster, and get out before anyone noticed. She hadn't expected to literally run into Marco's car at his own gates. "Mama, I'm scared," little Maria whispered, pressing closer to her leg. "She baby. It's okay." But it wasn't okay. Nothing had been okay for a very long time. After she'd left Marco, Sophia had gone to her father. But he'd been ill. Dying actually, though neither of them had known it yet. She'd spent her savings caring for him through his final months, holding his hand as cancer ate him from the inside. "I'm sorry I can't leave you anything," he'd whispered near the end. "You gave me everything that matters, Papa. You taught me to value honor over comfort. Honor is cold comfort with babies on the way, Mija." After he'd died she'd been alone and pregnant and broke. She'd tried to get her teaching job back, but the principal had been apologetic. "Mrs. Valentino, I can't. Your husband, he has connections. People are afraid." "I'm sorry." She'd found out quickly that being Marco's ex-wife was worse than being his wife. People were too scared to hire her. Too afraid of what helping her might bring down on their heads. The few who hadn't been scared had assumed she had access to Marco's money, and offered her no charity. She'd sold everything she owned. When the twins had been born, 2 months premature, the hospital bills had consumed what little she'd saved. They'd spent 3 weeks in the NU. And she'd spent 3 weeks in hell, watching her tiny babies fight for every breath, while she filled out paperwork she couldn't afford. A social worker had suggested she contact the father. He has resources, Mrs. Valentino. These babies need specialized care. He made his position clear. We're better off without his blood money. But Pride didn't pay hospital bills. Pride didn't buy formula or diapers or keep the heat on in winter. She'd ended up in shelters, moving from one to another as space allowed. Some nights. And she'd walk the streets with 2 infants. Too terrified to sleep in case someone tried to take them. She'd tried government assistance. But the bureaucracy moved slowly and there were always more forms. More waiting, more hoops to jump through. Meanwhile, babies needed to eat every day. That's when she'd started collecting scrap. It was honest work, at least. No one could say she'd compromised her principles. She'd push her cart through alleys and construction sites, collecting anything metal, anything recyclable. The twins would ride in the cart when they were smaller, sleep while she worked. Now that they could walk, they followed her like small ghosts. Silent and watchful in the way children became when they learned too early that the world was hard. Some days were better than others. Some days she'd find enough to buy real food, maybe even a second-hand toy for the children. Other days like today. Desperation pushed her into neighborhoods she knew she should avoid. And now here she was, face to face with the man she'd fled. The father her children had never known, standing in front of a mansion that probably cost more than she'd earn in 10 lifetimes of collecting scrap. Marco. Her voice came out as a whisper. He stood there in his perfect suit next to his perfect woman, and Sophia saw the recognition in his eyes. Followed by shock, followed by something that might have been pain or might have been anger. The blonde woman, his fiancée apparently, was tugging at his arm. Marco, who is this woman? Why are we just standing here? But Marco didn't seem to hear her. He was staring at the twins, his face gone pale. Are they? His voice broke. Sophia, are they mine? Little Matteo chose that moment to peek out from behind her skirt. His face the mirror image of his father's. The silence stretched impossibly long. Isabella Rossi was not a stupid woman. She'd built her life on reading situations quickly, understanding power dynamics, knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. Right now, every instinct screamed that her perfect future was unraveling in real time. Marco, she said again, more firmly. Who is this? He finally looked at her. And Isabella saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before, genuine emotion, raw and unfiltered. This is Sophia. My ex-wife. Ex-wife. He'd mentioned her exactly once in passing, saying only that he'd been married young and it hadn't worked out. He'd made it sound trivial. A youthful mistake corrected. This was not trivial. And the children? Isabella heard herself ask, though she already knew. Marco seemed unable to form words. Sophia spoke instead, her voice steady despite her obvious exhaustion. Twins, Matteo and Maria. And yes, Marco is their father, though he hasn't been interested in that fact until this very moment. That's not fair, Marco said, finding his voice. You left. You disappeared. You threw me out. You said the babies were better off without you. I was angry. I didn't mean, you meant it. You meant every word. Sophia's composure cracked slightly. And you were right, Marco. They are better off learning that integrity matters more than wealth. That you can be poor and still be good. These children will never grow up thinking that violence and corruption are acceptable. Isabella watched this exchange with growing horror. This wasn't just an ex-wife. This was unfinished business, unresolved feelings. A whole other life that Marco had never properly closed. You're living on the street. Marco said, his voice strained. Dragging them through garbage. How is that better? We're not on the street. We have shelter. Sophia lifted her chin with dignity that shouldn't have been possible given her circumstances. And this isn't garbage, it's honest work. I'm teaching them that you earn what you have. That you don't take from others. That your hands can be dirty without your soul being corrupt. Every word was an arrow aimed directly at Marco, and Isabella watched them hit their mark. Sophia. Please. Let me help. Let me. He took a step toward her. No. Sophia stepped back, pulling the children with her. I don't want your help, Marco. I don't want anything from you. They're my children. They're the children you rejected. You don't get to claim them now because your fiancé is watching and you want to look like a good man. The words hung in the air like a slap. Isabella felt her carefully constructed future crumbling. She'd signed up to be a Mafia boss wife, yes, but a clean slate. No messy ex-wives, no secret children. No complications. Just power and money and the respect that came with the Valentino name. This was not the deal, Marco. Isabella said quietly. We should go inside. This isn't the time or place for this conversation. But Marco wasn't listening to her. He was still staring at his children. And Isabella recognized the look on his face. It was the same look her father got when he realized he'd lost a negotiation, when the cost of victory suddenly seemed too high. How long? Marco asked Sophia. How long have you been living like this? Does it matter? How long? Sophia. Since 2 months after I left. Since Papa died and I had no one else. Since you made it clear that anyone who helped me would suffer. Since the entire city became afraid of your name. Marco flinched. I never told anyone to hurt you. You didn't have to. Your reputation did that work for you. Sophia shifted the cart handle, preparing to leave. We should go. Come on, babies. Wait. Marco moved forward quickly. Too quickly. His bodyguards, who'd been standing silently by the car, tensed. Sophia froze, fear flashing across her face. And Isabella saw how Sophia instinctively moved to shield the children with her own body. That simple gesture, that maternal fear, seemed to break something in Marco. I'm not going to hurt you, he said, his voice thick. Sophia, please. I need to understand. Why didn't you tell me? When they were born, why didn't you reach out? Sophia laughed, a broken sound. Tell you. Marco, I tried. The day they were born 2 months early. Struggling to breathe, I called you. Do you remember what your assistant said? That you were in a meeting and couldn't be disturbed. I called back 6 times that day. You never returned a single call. I didn't know. I would have. You would have what? Cared. The Marco I married would have cared. The Marco I left doesn't care about anything except power and money. That's not true, isn't it? Look at us, Marco. Really look. Your children are wearing shoes held together with tape. Maria's coat is from a donation bin and it's still too big. Matteo hasn't had a full meal in 3 days. We sleep in a room with 12 other people, and every night I lie awake terrified that someone will hurt them. That I won't be able to protect them. Her voice was rising now, years of suppressed pain flooding out. And you? You're standing here in a suit that costs more than I'll make in a year, introducing your pretty new fiancé to a mansion built on blood and broken lives. So tell me, Marco, what exactly would you have done if I'd told you about the twins? Given me money to assuage your guilt. Hired me a nice apartment so you could visit when convenient and play father without actually changing anything about your life. I would have helped. I would have made sure you were safe. That the children had everything they needed. I don't want your dirty money. I don't want my children growing up thinking that comfort is worth more than character. Character doesn't keep children alive. Neither does blood money! It just buys you prettier ways to die inside. They were shouting now, years of hurt and anger and betrayal spilling into the afternoon air. The bodyguards shifted uncomfortably. Isabella stood frozen, realizing with growing certainty that she was watching something she had no part in. A drama that had been playing out long before she'd entered Marco's life. And the children. Those 2 small children with their father's eyes and their mother's dignity, stood silent between their parents. Not understanding the words but absorbing the emotion, learning lessons about love and pain that no 4-year-old should have to learn. Finally, Sophia's rage seemed to exhaust itself. She slumped slightly, one hand going to her side. Isabella noticed for the first time how thin she was, how her clothes hung on a frame that was probably once fuller, healthier. I'm done, Sophia said quietly. I'm done arguing with you, Marco. I'm done trying to make you understand that some things matter more than money. You made your choices and I made mine. Let's just leave it at that. I can't. Marco's voice was raw. Sophia, I can't just watch you walk away like this. Those are my children, yes they are. And you threw them away before they were even born. I was wrong. Is that what you need to hear? I was wrong, I've been wrong about so many things. But please. Let me make it right now. Sophia looked at him for a long moment. And Isabella saw something pass between them, some communication that went deeper than words. You can't make it right, Marco. Some things once broken can't be fixed. Then let me try anyway, please. Sophia closed her eyes. When she opened them again, there was a resolution there that made Isabella's stomach sink. If you truly want to help, if this isn't just guilt talking, then prove it. Not with money. With change. What do you mean? This life you've built, this empire of violence and fear, walk away from it. Become the man I married again. Show our children that their father is capable of choosing right over easy, honor over power. The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella watched Marco's face cycle through emotions: shock, consideration, denial, fear. She knew even before his answer would be. Sophia. That's not. I can't just walk away. It's not that simple. It is that simple. It's just not easy. But nothing worth doing ever is. You don't understand the obligations, the people who depend on me, the consequences. I understand perfectly. You're saying that your criminal empire matters more than your children. That's not fair. Life isn't fair, Marco. I learned that when I had to choose between feeding my babies and keeping a roof over our heads. You're learning it now. She picked up the cart handle again. Sophia, don't. We can find a middle ground, we can. There is no middle ground between right and wrong, Marco. There never was. That was always your mistake. Thinking you could compromise on character. She started to walk away, the twins following like small shadows. Marco took a step after them. But Isabella finally found her voice. Marco, let her go. He turned to her, and the look in his eyes was wild, lost. I can't just let my children live like that. Then give her money. Set up an account, buy her a house, whatever she needs. But you can't change your entire life because an ex-wife showed up at an inconvenient moment. It was the practical thing to say, the rational thing. But even as the words left Isabella's mouth, she knew they were wrong. Marco knew it too. She could see it in his eyes. Money won't fix this. He said softly. Then what will? He didn't answer. He just stood there, watching Sophia and the twins disappear around the corner. The squeaky wheels of the scrap cart fading into the distance. Finally, he turned back to the gates, to the symbol of everything he'd built. Let's go inside, he said, his voice flat. But Isabella knew, even as they walked through those gates, that something fundamental had shifted. The mansion was the same, the money was the same, the power was the same. But the man was different. That night, Marco sat alone in his study. A glass of expensive scotch untouched on the desk beside him. Isabella had retired early, claiming a headache, but he knew the truth. She was giving him space to process, or perhaps creating space to process herself. He should be planning his next move, strategizing how to handle this situation. That's what the old Marco would have done, the Marco who'd built an empire on calculated risks and careful control. But he couldn't stop seeing his children's faces. Matteo's eyes, so like his own, watching everything with a wariness no child should possess. Maria's thin frame, swimming in an oversized coat. The way they'd both clung to Sophia, trusting only her, knowing nothing that helped create them. His phone rang. Tony. Boss, you asked me to find information on your wife. Ex-wife, I mean. What did you find? She's been staying at St. Catherine's shelter on the east side. Before that, she was at 3 other shelters. Before that, she was sleeping in her car. Before that, she was in the hospital with the twins. Boss. I got the medical records. Those kids were born at 28 weeks, each weighing less than 3 pounds. They had respiratory problems, feeding issues. The whole thing. The hospital bill was over $300,000. Marco felt his chest tighten. How did she pay it? She didn't. It went to collections. She's got so much medical debt she'll never pay it off. And boss. She's got nothing. No bank account, no credit cards. No assets. She exists completely off the grid. The only income we can track is from selling scrap metal, and that's maybe $300-400 a month on a good month. $400 a month. Less than Marco spent on wine. The kids, are they healthy now? According to the shelter's medical records, they're underweight and Maria has asthma, probably from the premature birth. She needs an inhaler. The prescription kind, but it costs too much, so the mom just uses the emergency room when it gets really bad. Marco closed his eyes. Anything else? Yeah. Boss, your wife, she's got people at that shelter who say she's one of the good ones. Helps other mothers, teaches art classes to the kids with donated supplies. Volunteers in the kitchen. Everyone says she never complains, never asks for special treatment. Just works hard and takes care of her kids. Of course she did. That was Sophia, always giving even when she had nothing left to give. Thanks, Tony. Boss, you want me to do anything about this? What he wanted was to turn back time. To be standing in that tiny apartment again with Sophia telling him she was pregnant. To make different choices, to be a different man, but time only moved forward. No. Not yet. He hung up and stared at the walls of his study. Lined with expensive art he'd never really looked at, first editions he'd never read, symbols of wealth that suddenly felt hollow. There was a soft knock at the door. Come in. Isabella entered, wrapped in a silk robe that probably cost more than Sophia's entire wardrobe. Can't sleep either? She asked. No. She sat down across from him, studying his face. You're going to help her, my children. I know. But Marco, be honest with me. Is it just about the children? He met her eyes and saw the question she was really asking. I don't know. He admitted. I loved her once, loved her more than I thought possible to love anyone. But I destroyed that love with my own hands. I don't know if what I'm feeling now is love or just guilt. Does it matter? Shouldn't it? Isabella was quiet for a long moment. My father once told me that the hardest thing about power is knowing when to let it go. He said most men hold on to it until it destroys them. Until they've sacrificed everything that actually mattered on the altar of staying powerful. Your father is a wise man. He's also a lonely man. My mother left him 20 years ago because she couldn't live with what he'd become. He chose power over her, and he's regretted it every day since. Marco looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something he hadn't expected: compassion. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm not stupid enough to think I can compete with a first love and 2 children who need their father. Because I'd rather end things now, cleanly, than spend years married to a man who's in love with his own regrets. Isabella. It's okay, I'm not angry. I'm actually relieved, in a strange way. I signed up to marry a successful man, not a tortured one. And Marco, you're about to become very tortured, one way or another. She stood up, leaning over to kiss his forehead gently. For what it's worth, I hope you choose right. Real right, not convenient right. After she left, Marco sat alone with his thoughts and his untouched scotch, and the weight of choices pressing down on him like physical things. The next morning, Marco sent Tony to St. Catherine's shelter with an envelope. Inside was cash, enough to cover 6 months of rent at a decent apartment, plus money for furniture, clothes, food, medical care. He waited for Sophia to call, to thank him or curse him or acknowledge it somehow. She sent the money back with a note written on the back of a shelter flyer. I told you. I don't want your money. He tried again. This time sending Tony to open a bank account in her name, depositing enough to ensure she'd never have to worry about basic needs again. She closed the account and donated the money to the shelter. He bought a small house in a safe neighborhood. Put it in her name, sent her the deed. She sold the house and used the proceeds to start a scholarship fund for children of incarcerated parents. Each rejection was like a knife. But also like a teacher, showing him that the problem couldn't be solved with money, that some wounds went deeper than wealth could reach. Meanwhile, his engagement to Isabella ended quietly, by mutual agreement. She returned the ring, accepted a generous settlement, and moved on to date a legitimate real estate developer. No hard feelings, just an acknowledgement that they'd been building on the wrong foundation. But ending the engagement didn't solve Marco's real problem. He was standing at a crossroads, and every road led to loss. Go back to Sophia and the children. But that meant walking away from the empire he'd built. Stay in his current life. But that meant accepting that he'd lost his children forever. That he'd chosen power over parenthood. The decision should have been easy. His children needed him. But walking away from this life wasn't like quitting a job. There were obligations, debts, enemies who'd see his departure as weakness to be exploited. There were people who depended on him. Legitimate businesses mixed in with the illegal ones. Employees with families who needed the income. And there was the deeper truth he didn't want to face. Part of him liked the power. Part of him had become comfortable with being feared, with having control, with the rush that came from danger and dominance. Sophia had been right. The man she'd married was gone, and Marco wasn't sure the current version of himself was capable of becoming the man again. Weeks passed. Marco found himself driving past St. Catherine's shelter, watching from a distance as Sophia shepherded the twins to the small playground across the street. He saw how carefully she watched them, how she rationed out pushes on the swing, making each child's turn last longer because there weren't many other pleasures in their day. He saw Matteo fall and skin his knee. Saw Sophia comfort him with gentle hands and soft words, kissing the scrape better, because she couldn't afford bandages for every small hurt. He saw Maria have an asthma attack. Saw the panic in Sophia's eyes as she dug through her bag for the emergency inhaler that might or might not still have medicine in it. And he saw how, when the attack passed and Maria could breathe again, Sophia held her daughter close and cried silently. Her shoulders shaking with the weight of poverty, and powerlessness and mother's love, that couldn't quite protect against everything. Marco watched all of this from his expensive car, and something in him began to crack. One evening, he didn't just watch. He got out of the car. Sophia saw him approaching and immediately moved between him and the children. What? I needed to see them. To see you. You've been watching us. It wasn't a question. Of course she'd noticed. Sophia had always been observant. Less. That's creepy, Marco. You need to stop. I will. But first, I need to say something. She crossed her arms, her body language screaming resistance, but she didn't walk away. You were right, Marco said. About everything. About what I became, about what I chose, about what I valued. You were right, and I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Apologies don't change anything. I know. But maybe actions can. He reached into his jacket, and Sophia tensed, probably expecting another envelope of money. Instead, he pulled out a folder. What's that? Papers. Signed documents transferring all my legitimate business interests into a trust. The restaurants. The real estate holdings. The construction companies. Everything that can be legally separated from the illegal operations. It's all going into a trust for Matteo and Maria, managed by an independent board until they turn 25. Sophia stared at the folder but didn't take it. And the illegal operations, I'm dismantling them. Slowly, carefully, in ways that won't get people killed, but I'm pulling out. It'll take time. Maybe 2 years, maybe more. There are obligations I can't just walk away from without consequences. But I'm starting the process. Why? Because you were right. Because my children deserve better than a father who's built his life on other people's suffering. Because I want to be able to look at them without shame. Sophia's eyes filled with tears. You're really doing this. I'm trying. I don't know if I can be the man you married again, Sophia. Too much has changed. But maybe I can be someone better than who I've become. She was quiet for a long moment, processing. This doesn't mean I'm taking you back. I know. And it doesn't mean I want your money. The trust isn't for you, it's for them. When they turn 25, they can choose what to do with it. Keep it, donate it, burn it, whatever they want. But at least they'll have options I never had. And what will you do? If you dismantle your empire, what's left? Marco smiled. And it was the saddest smile Sophia had ever seen. I guess I'll find out. The process of dismantling a criminal empire turned out to be exponentially harder than building one. Every operation Marco tried to shut down had tentacles reaching into others. Every associate he tried to pay off had connections to people who didn't want to be paid off. And there were people who saw his withdrawal as betrayal. The first attempt on his life came 3 months in. A car bomb, poorly made, that his driver noticed before starting the engine. The second attempt was more sophisticated poison in his food at a restaurant he frequented. He survived only because his food taster. A precaution he'd maintained from his early days, died in his place. After that, Marco moved out of the mansion. Too visible, too much a target. He relocated to a modest apartment in a neighborhood where anonymity was possible, where people did their own business and didn't ask questions. He liquidated assets, paid off debts, severed connections. Some of his former associates understood. Others didn't. Tony came to see him one night. Looking troubled. "Boss, there's talk. People saying you've gone soft, that you're weak. Marconi's crew is making moves on the waterfront operations. Let them have it. Boss, that's $1 million a month in revenue. I don't want it any more of it." Tony studied him carefully. "This is really about that woman and those kids, isn't it?" "It's about a lot of things. But yeah, mostly about them. You love her still?" Marco considered the question. "I don't know if what I feel is love or just regret for what I destroyed. But I know I can't live with myself the way I was living anymore. And if they never take you back, if you give all this up and end up alone anyway, then at least I'll be alone with a clear conscience." Tony shook his head. "You're either the bravest man I know or the stupidest. Probably both." As Tony left, he turned back. "For what it's worth, boss, I respect what you're doing. Takes guts to admit you were wrong." Sophia heard about the attempts on Marco's life through the shelter's grapevine. News traveled fast in the communities that existed on society's margins. And the fall of Marco Valentino was big news. She told herself she didn't care, that he'd made his choices and now lived with the consequences. But at night, lying on her cot in the shelter while the twins slept on either side of her, she found herself worrying. The Marco she'd married wouldn't have survived in the world he'd built. But the Marco who'd built that world was the father of her children, and despite everything, she didn't want them to grow up fatherless. One evening, after the twins were asleep, she called the number Tony had left with the shelter director months ago. "This is Sophia. I need to speak to Marco." Tony sounded surprised but pleased. "I'll get on." When Marco's voice came on the line, it sounded tired in ways that had nothing to do with sleep. "Sophia, I heard about the attempts. Are you safe?" "Safety enough. I've got security. And I'm being careful. The children ask about you sometimes. They see other kids with fathers and they wonder." Marco's silence spoke volumes. "What do you tell them?" he finally asked. "I tell them their father is trying to become a better man. I tell them it's hard work, changing who you are, but that it's worth doing. Do they understand? They're 4. They understand that some things are hard but important. That's enough for now. Sophia, can I see them? Even just for an hour?" She'd known he'd ask eventually. She'd been preparing her answer for weeks. "Not yet. When you're really out, when you've actually left that life behind, then we can talk about visitation. But I won't expose them to that world, Marco. I won't let them think that violence and crime are normal just because their father can't fully leave them behind." "That's fair." "Is it hard? Leaving it all behind?" "Harder than I imagined. I thought the hard part would be walking away from the money and power. But the really hard part is facing who I became, who I let myself turn into. Every day I find another piece of my soul that needs rebuilding." His honesty surprised her. "Why are you really doing this, Marco? And don't say it's just for the children, that's part of it. But there's more." He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. "You remember that conversation we had in the library? Our first real conversation. About the ceiling molding. You said most people never look up. I think I spent the last 6 years looking down. Looking at the dirt and the violence and the worst of humanity, until I forgot that there was anything else. You and the kids, seeing you outside those gates. It made me look up again. And I realized I didn't like what I'd built when I was only looking down." Sophia felt tears welling up. "That's the Marco I married talking. Maybe he's not completely gone after all." After they hung up, Sophia sat in the darkness and cried. For the man Marco had been, for the man he'd become, and for the man he was trying to be. A year passed. Marco sold off the last of his illegal operations, though not without cost. He bore the scars now, literal and metaphorical. A knife wound from a betrayed associate. burn marks from a warehouse fire set by rivals. And the deeper scars, the ones that didn't show from watching men he'd once called friends turn into enemies. But he persevered. He started small, legitimate. A consulting business, helping small companies with their finances. It was honest work, using his business degree for its intended purpose. The money was nothing compared to what he'd made before, but it was clean. He volunteered at a community center, teaching kids from the neighborhood about financial literacy. Some of them were sons and daughters of men he'd once victimized, though they didn't know it. He taught them anyway, seeing it as a kind of penance, and slowly, gradually, he began to rebuild a self he could respect. Sophia watched from a distance at first, cautious, making sure the change was real and lasting. She saw him turn down offers to return to his old life. Watched him walk away from easy money, observed how he handled conflicts without resorting to violence. After 18 months, she agreed to let him meet the twins. They met in a public park, neutral territory, safe. Marco arrived early, nervous in ways he'd never been when negotiating $1 million deals or facing down armed rivals. When Sophia arrived with Matteo and Maria, Marco's breath caught. The children had grown, looked healthier. Sophia had explained that she'd finally accepted help from a non-profit that assisted single mothers, had gotten a small apartment and a part-time teaching job. Pride hadn't kept her from that help, she'd explained, because it wasn't built on crime. Maria, this is Marco. He's your father. The twins stared at him with identical expressions of curiosity mixed with caution. You're the one Mama talks about, Matteo said. The one who's trying to be better. Marco knelt down to their level. Yes, I'm trying very hard. Mama says trying is important. Maria added. She says even when things are hard, you have to keep trying. Your mama is very wise. They spent an hour together. Marco pushed them on the swings, helped them across the monkey bars, bought them ice cream from a vendor. Simple things, normal things. Things that wealthy Marco Valentino would have considered beneath him, but that this newer, humbler Marco found precious. At the end, as Sophia prepared to leave, Matteo surprised everyone by hugging Marco's leg. Will you come again? Marco looked at Sophia, who nodded slowly. If it's okay with your mama. I'd like to come every week. It's okay, Sophia said quietly. As long as you keep trying. The weekly visits became bi-weekly. Then frequent enough that schedules had to be coordinated. Marco became a fixture in the twins' lives. Not a perfect father but a present one. Learning how to braid Maria's hair, how to help Matteo with his numbers, how to read bedtime stories with all the right voices. And somewhere in the midst of learning to be a father, he and Sophia began learning to be friends again. It started with co-parenting conversations that stretched into discussions about art, about books, about the news. Sophia shared her lesson plans, and Marco offered suggestions. Marco talked about his struggles with his new business, and Sophia reminded him why honest work mattered even when it was hard. They didn't talk about the past often, but when they did, Marco never made excuses. I was wrong, he'd say simply. I chose power over everything that mattered. And I lost everything as a result. But you're choosing differently now. Sophia would respond. That counts for something. 2 years after that fateful meeting at the gates, Marco's old life was completely dismantled. The mansion had been sold. The proceeds divided between restitution to victims and the children's trust. His former associates had either found new leadership, or gone legitimate themselves. The attempts on his life had stopped, partly because he was no longer a threat, and partly because he'd made peace with the people who'd wanted him dead. He lived simply now, in a small apartment not unlike the one he and Sophia had shared as newlyweds. He worked his consulting business, saved carefully, lived within his means. On weekends he had the twins, teaching them to cook and helping with homework, and taking them to museums where Sophia would sometimes join them. It was during one of these museum visits that Maria, now 6 years old and perceptive beyond her years, asked the question. Daddy, do you still love Mama? They were standing in front of a painting, a Renaissance piece showing a family at prayer. Sophia had gone to find a restroom, leaving Marco alone with the twins. Marco looked down at his daughter, seeing Sophia's eyes looking back at him. Yes. he said honestly. I never stopped loving her. I just forgot how to show it in ways that mattered. Then why don't you live with us? Matteo joined in. Yeah. All my friends have their mamas and daddies together. Marco knelt down, gathering them close. Because sometimes when you hurt someone badly enough, they need time to heal before they can trust you again. I hurt your mama very badly, and even though I'm sorry and I'm trying to be better, she needs to decide if she wants to forgive me. Have you asked her? Maria wanted to know. Not yet. I want to make sure I'm really the man she deserves before I ask her to take that risk again. When Sophia returned, she found the three of them sitting on a bench. The twins explaining to Marco why he should definitely ask Mama to marry him again. Because then they could all live together and be a real family. She caught Marco's eye over their heads. And something passed between them, some understanding that the past was fading and the future was becoming possible. It happened on a Tuesday. Marco had taken the day off work to help at the twins' school carnival. He'd spent the afternoon running the rin toss booth, watching Sophia teach face painting to a line of excited children, seeing how naturally she moved in this world of normalcy and innocence. After the carnival, as they walked the twins home, Matteo and Maria running ahead to chase pigeons, Sophia spoke quietly, "You've changed." "I hope so." "No, I mean really changed. When I look at you now, I see the man I married. Not the same man exactly, but the important parts, the parts that matter." Marco's heart was pounding. "Sophia. I'm not saying I'm ready to get married again. I'm not even saying I'm ready to date. But I'm saying that I forgive you, Marco. For what you became. For what you did, for the hurt you caused. I forgive you." He stopped walking, turning to face her. There were tears in his eyes. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. Probably not. But I'm giving it anyway because holding on to anger was making me hard in ways I don't want to be. And because our children deserve to grow up seeing that people can change, that redemption is possible. I love you." Marco said. "I know I don't have the right to say that, but it's true. I love you. And I want to spend the rest of my life proving I can be the man you deserve." Sophia smiled, and it was like watching the sun rise. "Then prove it. Not with grand gestures or promises, but with daily choices, with being present and honest and good. Show me, Marco. Don't tell me." "I will. I swear I will." They didn't kiss. It was too soon for that. Too much healing still needed. But they held hands as they walked home, their children running ahead, and it felt like a beginning. 3 years later, in a small ceremony attended by close friends and family, Marco and Sophia renewed their vows. Not in a mansion or a grand cathedral, but in the community center where Marco volunteered. Surrounded by people they'd helped and who had helped them. The twins were flower girl and ring bearer. 8 years old now and glowing with the joy of having their family whole. Marco's vows were simple. "I promise to choose right over easy, every day. For the rest of my life. I promise to be a father our children can be proud of, and a husband worthy of your trust. I promise to never forget that character matters more than comfort, and that the richest life is one lived with integrity." Sophia's vows echoed his. "I promise to forgive your mistakes and celebrate your growth. I promise to see you not as who you were, but as who you're becoming. I promise to build a life with you based on honesty, compassion, and love." When they kissed, the room erupted in applause. Later, at the modest reception held in the center's multi-purpose room, Marco's mother pulled him aside. "Your father would be proud," she said, tears in her eyes. "Not of the money or the power, but of this. Of you finding your way back to what matters." Tony, now running his own legitimate security business, raised a glass to the boss who had everything and gave it up for what actually mattered. Saw the twins, hyped up on cake and dancing, pulled their parents onto the floor for a group dance that was more chaos than choreography. And Marco, holding his wife close with his children spinning around them, felt richer than he'd ever felt in the mansion. More powerful than he'd ever felt with an empire. More successful than all his criminal achievements combined. Because he'd learned the hardest lesson of all. That true wealth wasn't measured in money or power or fear. It was measured in love freely given, in forgiveness earned through change. in the laughter of children who trusted you, in the hand of a woman who'd seen you at your worst and still believed you could be better. Years passed. The twins grew into teenagers, then young adults. They knew their father's history. Not because he hid it, but because he'd taught them that acknowledging mistakes was the first step in not repeating them. "Tell us again about the gates," Maria would sometimes ask when she struggled with a moral decision. And Marco would tell the story of the day he stood in front of his mansion with a fiancée on his arm and saw his children for the first time living in poverty because of his choices. "The gates represented everything I thought I wanted," he'd say. "Power, wealth, success. But on the other side of those gates were the things I actually needed: family, integrity, love. I'd been so focused on building the mansion that I'd forgotten what a home actually was." "And Mama taught you to remember," Mathieu would add. "Mama and you too. You taught me that some prices are too high to pay, that some things, once lost, can't be bought back. You have to earn them." The children took the lessons to heart. Maria became a social worker, helping families in crisis. Matteo studied law, focusing on prison reform and rehabilitation. Neither of them touched the trust fund Marco had set up, choosing instead to donate it to causes that helped people escape the kind of life their father had once led. When they made that decision, Marco cried with pride. "You raised them right," he told Sophia. "We raised them right," she corrected. On their 20th wedding anniversary. Their second wedding anniversary, but what felt like a lifetime of marriage, Marco and Sophia sat on the porch of their modest home and watched the sunset. "Do you ever regret it?" Sophia asked. "Giving up all that money and power?" Marco thought about the mansion he'd sold, the empire he'd dismantled, the wealth he'd walked away from. Then he thought about mornings waking up next to Sophia, about family dinners filled with laughter, about grandchildren who'd soon be on the way, about nights he slept peacefully without fear or guilt. "Not for a single second," he said. And he meant it. Because he'd learned that the real measure of a man wasn't what he could take or keep, but what he was willing to give up for what truly mattered. He'd stood at those mansion gates with everything the world said he should want. And he'd walked away from all to earn back what he actually needed. That wasn't weakness, that was the bravest thing he'd ever done. Morale: true wealth isn't found in the things we accumulate, but in the integrity we maintain and the love we nurture. Power built on the suffering of others is a mansion with locked gates. Impressive from the outside but empty within. The hardest journey isn't climbing to the top, but having the courage to walk away when you realize you've climbed the wrong mountain. Real strength lies not in refusing to change, but in having the humility to admit when you've been wrong and the courage to become better. Character cannot be bought, only built. One honest choice at a time. One act of integrity after another, until the person you see in the mirror is someone your children can admire, and someone you can respect. The gates we build to protect our empires often become the bars that imprison our souls, and sometimes the only way to be truly free is to tear them down ourselves. In the end, we are measured not by what we possessed, but by what we were willing to sacrifice for those we love. And the greatest inheritance we can leave our children is not money, but the example of a life lived with honor.